Welcome, friends. Today we have Dave back. Thank you, Dave, for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Randy.
Oh, and I don't have my light on. Yeah, so as you can see, we are not pros here. We are just two guys who are lovers of wisdom. We have seen, felt, experienced what Richard Rohr writes in the book, Falling Upward, a spirituality for the two halves of life. Now, hopefully by this point you've tuned in and you've heard Dave and I talk about what the book's about, the introduction. If you haven't, for the sake of time, we're not going to go through it all. So if you can tune in, listen to that. Dave explains it very well. By the way, if you haven't seen that, you may not know Dave. By the way, he's a father, husband, a teacher, a pastor, a lover of wisdom, philosophy. He's well versed in many traditions, and that makes him uniquely qualified to talk on this topic. Oh yeah, also, he leads a book study on Wednesdays on this as well, too. So this has been very, very helpful for me. I've read the book before. It was a long time ago. The discussions on Wednesdays nights, which, by the way, 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll include a link in it. It is dark for the holidays, so it'll be kicking back up in January, first Wednesday in January, correct, Dave?
Yes, but we've only got 2 or 3 more sessions, so we're almost done. But everything is archived, and if they're interested in picking up some of those other sessions, they can do that as well.
Yes, absolutely. So what I'm saying is Dave can help explain what we're going to read. And we're just going to read a couple pages and then kind of come back and hit what's highlighted. And hopefully we'll give you something to consider. It's helped me, and I think it might help you. So that being said, let's do a screen share. And with that, here we go. Got it. Come on. There we go. It's there. So we're still in the introduction section, and this one is headed as the way up and the way down. So Rohr writes, the soul has many secrets. They are only revealed to those who want them and are never completely forced upon us. One of the best kept secrets, and yet one hidden in plain sight, is that the way up is the way down. Or if you prefer, the way down is the way up. This pattern is obvious in all of nature, from the very change of seasons and substances on this earth, to the 600 million tons of hydrogen that the sun burns every day to light and warm our earth, even to the metabolic laws of dieting and fasting. The down-up pattern is constant too in mythology, stories like that of Persephone, who must descend into the underworld and marry Hades for spring to be reborn. In legends and literature, sacrifice of something to achieve something else is almost the only pattern. Dr. Faust has to sell his soul to the devil to achieve power and knowledge. Sleeping Beauty must sleep for 100 years before she can receive the prince's kiss. In scripture, we see that the wrestling and the wounding of Jacob are necessary for Jacob to become Israel, and the death and resurrection of Jesus are necessary to create Christianity. The loss and renewal pattern is so constant and ubiquitous that it should hardly be called a secret at all. Yet it is still a secret, probably because we don't want to see it. We do not want to embark on a further journey if it feels like going down, especially after we've put so much sound and fury into going up. This is surely the first and primary reason why people never go to the fullness of their own lives. The supposed achievements of the first half of life have to fall apart and show themselves to be wanting in some way, or we will not move further. Why would we? Normally, a job, fortune, or reputation has to be lost, a death has to be suffered, or a house has to be flooded, or a disease has to be endured. The pattern, in fact, is so clear that one has to work rather hard or be intellectually lazy to miss the continual lesson. This, of course, was Scott Peck's major insight in his best-selling book, The Road Less Traveled. He told me personally once that he felt most Western people were spiritually lazy, and that when we are lazy, we stay on path we are already on, even if it's going nowhere. It is the spiritual equivalent to the second law of thermodynamics. Everything winds down unless some outside force winds it back up. True spirituality could be called the outside force, although surprisingly it is found inside, but we would get into that later. Some kind of falling, what I would soon call necessary suffering, is programmed into the journey. All the sources seem to say it, starting with Adam and Eve and all they represent. Yes, they sinned and were cast out of the Garden of Eden, but from those very acts came conscious, in their own further journey. But it all started with transgression. Only people unfamiliar with sacred story are surprised that they ate the apple. As soon as God told them specifically not to, you know they will. It creates the whole storyline inside which we can find ourselves. It is not that suffering or failure might happen, or that it will only happen to you if you are bad, which is what religious people often think, or that it will happen to the unfortunate or to a few in other places, but you can somehow by cleverness or righteousness avoid it. No, it will happen, and to you. Losing, failing, falling, sin, and the suffering that comes from those experiences. All of this is a necessary, even good part of the human journey. As my favorite mystic, Lady Julian of Norwich, put it in her Middle English, sin is behoovely. Okay, we'll end there. And with that being said, we shall begin the discussion. So if you can see this video, you're not just listening, if you can see this, what I've done as before, highlighted a few sections that I think are important for us to return to and contemplate. So that being said, here, the soul has many secrets. They are only revealed to those who want them and are never completely forced upon us. One of the best kept secrets, and yet one hidden in plain sight, is that the way up is the way down. Or if you prefer, the way down is the way up. What are your thoughts on this, Dave?
Well, this is a pattern that we can't avoid. And as much as Rohr says we might like to, it's a pattern that is, as he says, it's in all of nature, but it's certainly in human experience. It's in our psycho-spiritual journeys. It's highly psychological, and at the same time, it's highly spiritual. And it's revealed to us in all of our literature. So this pattern in Christianity, it's called the Paschal mystery. Jesus has to die in order to rise again. But we see that in all the mythologies and all of the traditions of the world, this pattern of dying to be reborn. Osiris dies and is reborn, and so on and so forth. He's going to use the story of Odysseus and the Odyssey later on. Again, Odysseus has to go into Hades in order to come back up the other side and take this journey. The hero's journey, rites of passage, all point to the same pattern of a descent before the ascent on the other side. And obviously there's a reason for this. And the reason is that it's very psychological for us. When he alluded to Adam and Eve later on in this passage, Adam and Eve sinning against God by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, the idea that they rebelled against it, against God's wishes, is metaphorical in a sense. It had to happen. We have to, as human beings, eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the sense of coming to the age of reason, coming to a place of self-awareness. That's what separates us from the animals, and that's what separates us in terms of each other. As soon as we become aware of ourselves as an individual entity, then we see ourselves in competition with and in separation from everyone else around us and everything else around us. And that egoic consciousness is what we are building in the first half of life. It's what allows us to survive physically. It's what allows ourselves to distinguish ourselves, to create that platform that we need to establish our lives and to launch our careers and our families and everything else. And that's vitally important for us to do so. The problem is that in our 20s and 30s, we are working so hard to establish this egoic presence that we become completely identified with it. We think that's who we are. That voice that talks to us in our head is us. Our accomplishments are us. Our jobs are us. Our family, our roles, even our attributes emotionally are us. And if we don't break through that at some point in our lives, that becomes the limit of our experience as human beings. The transition into the second half of life is to break through that egoic consciousness and realize that the ego, our self-awareness, is just a tool. It's our interface with the world, and it's a tool that we use in order to be able to live our physical lives. But who we really are is much deeper than that. Who we really are is a true self, as it's been called, that really can't be named. It can't be expressed. It can only be experienced. But the only way to get to that experience is to realize that the egoic consciousness is a facade, and to be able to break through that and see, first of all, see that there's another there, and then to do the work that it takes to get there is the work of the second half of life. And this is borne out in the hero's journey, where there always has to be a wounding. Often it's the trauma in our lives. He talks about the failings and the fallings that are absolutely necessary. Sin is behovely, as Lady Julian put it, which means that it's necessary. We have to have this. That failing and falling is what breaks down our identification with the ego. Whenever we've experienced some extreme loss, whatever it happens to be, whether it's a loss of a loved one, loss of a job, a career, a dream, whatever, then that is breaking down who we think we are. Loss is always a loss of our identity. That's why it hurts so much. It feels like death. Why do we fear death? Because it's a loss of everything we think it means egoically to be ourselves. What continues after that? Does anything continue after that? Well, the more that we do experience second half of life consciousness and that deeper self, then we get a sense of what does continue after that. But it is that process that we're talking about. The hero's journey that begins with the wounding and then pushes us into a new world that we don't understand, that second half of life world, tasks that we have to perform, guides who come and help us and give us gifts and tools to be able to use along the way, so that we make that circular journey and come back to where we started, but know something more about the place than we did before. And that idea of a spiral journey of ascent, that it's always a descent, a series of descents and ascents, loss, and then reincorporation. It's the same thing with the rites of passage, a classic rite of passage. There's a separation, a transition, and a reincorporation. The separation is the descent. The transition is the way through understanding this new world. And then the reincorporation is coming back to the village, coming back to the people, but now with a changed status, a new wisdom that can be given back to the group. And so this cracking of the shell of the ego consciousness, and vanquishing of the ego, is what feels like death. And so all of the symbolism, whether it's Odysseus or whether it's Jesus or whether it's Neo in the Matrix or Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, Parsifal in the Holy Grail myths, all of those are speaking of these little deaths that occur along the way, where the ego gets cracked and we see something else out there. It is always going to be at the expense of who we think we are and what we think we know to move on to this deeper place that here we are calling the second half of life. So it's a pattern that is just part of nature, as he says, baked into the cake of even the second law of thermodynamics, and baked into what we see in nature around us, and baked into our own psychology and spirituality.
Dave, I've been using the format of typically hitting the highlights there. I think you've just surmised everything that Roy wrote over the last 2 pages. Thank you. That was super easy.
Super easy, but super hard. It's hard to overestimate the difficulty that it is to break through the illusions of the ego. I mean, we really build that build those walls, build that platform, build that shell around us so well. You know, that's why the movie The Matrix is brilliant in the way that it describes the Matrix itself. I mean, it is so finely tuned that for all intents and purposes, it is reality to those who are inside of it. It is everything to those who are inside of it. It is the world that they experience. It's the ground on which they walk. It's the air that they breathe. And that's what it's like being inside the ego. We believe this is reality and this is who we are. But we don't realize that it's kind of a filter. We don't see reality directly. We see it through the filter of what we believe, our worldview, and who we think we are. And so reality, by the time it goes through the filter, only conforms to what we already think we know. How do you break through that? And how painful is it to break through that? You know, he says that Scott Peck says we're spiritually lazy. That may be true to a certain extent, but I think it's really more that culturally we're not taught anymore that there is anything more. You know, we're this youth-obsessed culture now here in the West, and the youth is, of course, are ensconced fully in the first half of life. If we're not going to revere our elders anymore, if we're not going to look past this youthful first half of life point of view and perspective, then there's no reason to go through the pain, the agony of breaking all that down and looking for something more. There is nothing more, according to our culture. So we're not even being taught. And not only is it our culture that's not doing it, as we pointed out last time, our church is not doing it. Our churches have become first half of life expressions. Actually, they always were. You know, the church is an institution. Any institution is a first half of life expression. And so for us to go against all that and break through it is harder and harder if none of our institutions and our culture itself is not reinforcing that the elders among us have something to offer, and that there is something beyond just our performance-based accomplishments and what we can simply see and touch and measure with our instruments. So we're really going to have to be salmon in the modern West if we're going to try to do a second half of life journey.
Yes. And as we're getting towards the end of what we read, some kind of falling, what I will soon call necessary suffering, is programmed into the journey. So yeah, as you mentioned, how the church is focusing on doing all the right stuff, on how we can be good people and such. And so from my personal experience, I interpret it as like, if I could be good enough, again, God's mercy and grace has accepted me into his kingdom, but I still must perform in a way that often is referred to as obedience. I'm always striving to be a good person, which, hey, you know, as long as I am not harming people, all in all, yeah, that's a better way to live. But of course, what is good, what is bad, and such as that. It's for each individual to discern, not necessarily an institution. And yes, somewhere along the line, life happens and humbles people. Well, certainly it humbled me and such. So I think, yeah, the challenge is there's, I guess the word would be dichotomy. You know, we have a worldview where the world tells us it's all about achievement and doing things right. That's what we're striving for, is what I'm getting at. But nature and the actual pattern of life is much more about doing it wrong. Is that a correct understanding, Dave?
No, that's fine. That's fine. This idea of the necessary suffering, this idea of, even if you want to call it the evil in the world that we see around us, you know, the whole question of theodicy, you know, the problem of evil. Why does evil exist in the world if God is good and God is all powerful? You know, that conundrum that we get into logically. It's going to, if we really subscribe to this second half of life pattern, it's going to change our whole worldview in the sense of the way we look at the world, the way we look at the way the world seems to be wired, why there is suffering in the world. Why isn't this a perfect utopia? Why can't we create a perfect utopia here on Earth? And I know some of us are still trying, but it's never been achieved. Jesus says we'll always have the poor with us, which is a statement about the condition of the world, that there always will be inequities, there will always be these problems. Why would that be so? And I can point to maybe this little story will help. Viktor Frankl, if you know who Viktor Frankl is, one of the fathers of modern psychology. He was a Jew in Austria, Holocaust survivor during World War II, in which his entire family was killed. He was the only one to survive the death camps, comes out the other side and devises what he calls logotherapy, which is the idea that what really drives mankind is the will to meaning. It's meaning that we are after. And once we can find meaning in life, then everything starts to make sense. He says that those who actually survived the death camps with their psyche and their integrity intact were those who found meaning in the pain. It's all about finding meaning. He tells a story of a elderly gentleman who comes into his psychological offices in Vienna, and he has lost his wife several years before and just can't get over the grief, and it's debilitating him. And he's come to the doctor for help. And so after he's listening to this man talk about his grief and his wife and all of this, after a while he stops and then he says, what would have happened if you had died first? He says, oh, that would have been terrible for her, the suffering that she would have, gone through. And he says, well, then in a way, she dying first and you suffering the loss of her was your way of, or the universe's way of keeping her from that suffering. And he stops and he thinks about it for a second, gets his coat and his hat, walks out and doesn't come back. So that's really not good for your practice, in terms of cash flow. But what it points to is that if you can find meaning in the pain, if you can find meaning in the suffering, it becomes overcomable. It actually becomes a noble or virtuous process to go through that suffering. Those of us who have gone to gone to the gym or tried aerobic experiences, we realize that the pain that we feel in that conditioning has a purpose to it. And we're willing to undergo that purpose because we know that it's not doing us any harm eventually. It's actually doing us good. And what the second half of life experience is about is realizing that the pain and the trauma that we go through, as heinous as it may seem, what could be more heinous than the death camps and losing your whole family to something as monstrous as Nazi Germany? To be able to see purpose in that, even in the pain of life, to see that grows us in some way, is to transform the way that we look at life. We stop asking the questions of why does this have to happen to me? Why do bad things have to happen to good people? But we start looking at, what am I being taught here? What can I learn here? And it changes once we see purpose in the pain, once we see that we can grow, become more compassionate, more loving, more empathetic, more understanding people by going through what we go through, then we can actually transcend it. Not to say that we're ever going to want to go through this, not to say that the perpetrators of the pain of other people don't need to be prosecuted, because obviously we need to do that. And it's not that we don't strive for a better world. I mean, that's part of it. We need to take this world seriously if we're actually going to go through these transformative processes. But to see that purpose in the pain changes everything. And I think that's another lesson here. If this if this descent ascent pattern is necessary and it's wired into the system, if it's somehow the only way that we grow as human beings into the fullness of what it means to be a human being, then there has to be purpose in the pain, and that transforms things. And even though it still hurts and has to hurt in order to do its job, in order to continue to break down that egoic shell, that egoic consciousness, it still changes the way we look at it. And I think that's a real important thing for us to consider through all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that is a lot to consider. And I think that surmises what we read over the last couple of pages. So with that being said, anything else you want to add, Dave, before we sign off?
No, I think we kicked this horse enough.
Yeah, I think you kicked it very well. Got us into a nice little gallop. So, yeah, folks, obviously having Dave around adds a perspective that I don't have. But on the other hand, I do want to have this keep moving forward. Dave's a busy man and he only can pop in once a week. So please bear with us, but know that Dave will be back shortly. And we'll talk a little bit more about this wonderful book that, again, can totally help you navigate these nasty things that you would have never volunteered for. But yeah, this is something that's really helped me, realize, well, my favorite Bible verse is Romans 12:2. Do not conform to the ways of the world, but be transformed by a renewing of your mind, so you'll be able to discern God's good and perfect will for your life. So, not conforming to the ways of the world. Well, again, I have always done, as I alluded to earlier, whatever I could do to avoid discomfort and pain and loss. But it is part of the deal, as Dave said. It's kind of wired into it. It's baked into the recipe, and yeah, it was, as Rourke talks about necessary suffering. He gets into it later, referring to unnecessary suffering. Seems to be kind of the stuff of denying, as I'm alluding to, seems to just kind of make it a little more difficult. Is that a correct understanding, Dave?
Yes, yes. Yeah. Unnecessary suffering is the suffering that we place on ourselves through the illusions that we continue to subscribe to, as opposed to those that are brought on outside of our control that we must navigate through. So yes, there's a difference between the two.
Yep. So again, we'll continue on here. We'll get more into this. It of course gets deeper and deeper as we move forward. And I look forward to sharing with you something that's changed my life. And Dave, you've certainly helped me over the years in this journey of unlearning. So thank you.
Great to be here, Randy.
All right, folks, again, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to sharing with you more in the near future. Until then, may peace be with you.